Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Talk, a webinar series by National Council of Applied Economic Research, National Data Innovation Center. I'm Sonalini Desai, a professor at NCER and director of the National Data Innovation Center. Today, we are going to be focusing on how to define and measure migration. The focus on migration really emerged sharply during the lockdown and the pandemic, when we saw lines of people walking home to their hometowns. It was also when we realized that we didn't have enough data, and yet migration affects every part of our life. Now, next time you are in Mumbai, ask your taxi driver where he's from. Chances are that he's from Jaunpur. UP is a large state, and yet Jaunpur is a small district, and nonetheless, the Jaunpuri drivers dominate the taxi scene in Mumbai. We go to Kerala during Church festival, and we discover that suddenly there is a real labor shortage because Bihari migrant workers have gone home for a month. Walk into a Haryana village, and you will see two women walking together. One has her face covered, and the other one does not. And it's very easy to tell which one is the daughter of the village and which one is the daughter-in-law. Migration affects every part of our life. And yet, when it comes to defining and measuring it, we run into a variety of challenges. Part of it is because migration is just very difficult to define. What is the reference period over which we consider somebody a migrant? How long does he need to be gone to be considered a migrant? How do we collect data on it? Bigger problem is that migration is very much a dynamic process where people come and go and suddenly become residents of certain areas. And yet we all know that migration is important in our lives. Most of us have some place where our families have come from that we still talk about as our native places, our ancestral homes. So today, what we have is a wonderful group of researchers and policy mavericks who have been focusing on issues of migration in a variety of ways. Our goal is to have an interesting discussion and open it up for comments and questions from the audience. Today, I'm joined by my colleague Reshma Roshania, who is an associate fellow at NCER. Reshma and I will moderate the discussion, throwing questions to some of our panelists. We will introduce panelists as we go along. Thank you for joining us. Reshma?
Great. Yes. So we're actually going to start off the discussion talking about implementation of migration data collection systems. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Mithali Sethi, who is an IAS officer, currently serving as the director of Vanamati, the Research and Training Institute of the Department of Agriculture in Maharashtra. Dr. Sethi led the development of the migrant tracking system on seasonal migrants in Maharashtra post the COVID lockdown, which was really the first of its kind in India. So, Dr. Mithali, firstly, can you speak to us about the importance of implementing such a system and tracking seasonal migrants? And what were the experiences of building the migration tracking system, including potential challenges such as conceptually defining even who is a migrant and who should be included in the tracking system?
Hi, thank you so much for your question. When we did this migrant tracking system, I was posted in a remote tribal belt in Maharashtra called Melghat, which is in the Amravati district. 75 to 80% of the population is a Korku tribal. And it was actually through serendipity that we actually discovered what was actually going on. So I'm just going to share my screen for a minute and just show some data that we collected. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Now, this is the data that we collected on severe acute malnutrition. And because I was posted in a tribal area where we used to talk about nutrition quite commonly, one of the questions I was looking to answer is how was the temporal pattern of malnutrition in Melghat? And while we were looking for answer to that question, we discovered, and I'll just point this out for everybody here, that Amravati had 14 blocks, and I was posted in a subdivision, which was 2 blocks that were tribal out of those 14 blocks. And so when we used to collect data and look at what is happening in the rest of the 12 blocks and in the 2 blocks that we were looking at, we realized that there was one point in time in the year where the number of malnourished children was 6 times more than the rest of the 12 blocks combined. And that was a little weird because I was told that the nutrition indicators would go worse in either monsoon, where diarrhea happens, or winter when there's hypothermia. And this was, I was looking at April data. And if you look at this April data here, you would see that we have, 875 malnourished children and you have 275 and 89 here. So the graph when we plotted was something like this. And we started going back the previous year and the previous year, and we saw the same graph every year for the last 3 to 4 years. So we started culturally correlating what is happening here. And what we understood at that point of time was that a lot of children who were actually migrating in October when the brick kiln season was starting would come back in March or April when they would celebrate Holi, which was the largest festival of the year in that area. And when they would come, all of these children who went either normal or already severe acute malnourished or moderately acute malnourished, they were coming back as with severe acute malnutrition, and that was what was driving our numbers up. So something that we did at that point of time was we started mapping where are people going. So very interestingly, the perceived notions of people and what would data tell you was very different. So when we started asking people that, where are children going? What do you think, where are children going? And they would say that, ये तो सब यहाँ जा रहे हैं. And so there were all reasons for why we cannot track migration, because it's outside our control, because either children are going outside the district or they're going outside the state. So we don't know where they're going. But in my data, when I used to track malnutrition, it would come OOS, which was out of station. So then we started going and meeting a few migrated families, and we wanted to just see what is happening and just meet people and see what are their problems and can we do something to track migration better. So then when we met them, and I remember I've written this in my op-ed also, where I went into this brick kiln and I asked this person कि यहाँ पे कितने बच्चे होंगे, to which he said that हम बच्चे नहीं गिनते because वो यहाँ पे काम नहीं करते हैं. So from that lens, when I met a lot of families, a lot of pregnant women, lactating women, children, I met a 9-month-old baby who was due for MMR vaccine, but was not given the vaccine because no health team had come and no Anganwadi worker had come. And so there was the contact was extremely difficult. Another thing that we did at that point was to make these lists where we started collecting village-wise lists of where people had gone by asking the Anganwadi worker that who are the missing children right now, give us a list, and then let's try to find these children at the destination. So what we basically did, I'll stop here and just wanted to show you the kind of data we collected. This is in Marathi. And we tried to understand the migration corridors that were existing at that point of time and who is going for what work, why are they going, where are they going, how many intra-district, inter-district, all these things that we did. Now, after we did all of this, we realized 2-3 things. Number one, a lot of population, a majority of the population was actually migrating intra-district. And so a district collector or a district chief executive officer of Zilla Parishad could have done a lot, but because of the fact that they did not know this to be true, they were not doing it. So to the questions of which Anganwadi has the highest out migration, which Anganwadi has the highest in migration, we did not know. So it was extremely important to build this data and to understand where is the out migration happening from, where is the in migration happening from, how do we introduce portability. Second insight I had was on portability, where when I started asking people, are your services portable? And my senior officers, my colleagues, that is education portable, is Anganwadi portable, is health portable? In principle, everything was portable, because they would say if people come to an Anganwadi, we would register them. If they come to us in a school, we would enroll them for education. If they come, we would give them the vaccination. If they come to the PHC. But nobody was going. I kept asking people that, do you go to the Anganwadi? Do you go to the PHC? Do you go to an Anganwadi? And they said no, because they don't know where the Anganwadi is. They didn't know where the PHC is. Health was somewhat, if it comes to that, people would go. But Anganwadi and education was bad. And later I found a study in Nandurbar that actually tracked longitudinally a cohort of people, a cohort of children who had gone and then come back after migration, in which the SAM numbers had kind of quadrupled after they had come back. So this question of, social protection, we started looking at portability, because I could not have stopped migration completely, and I knew that. So apart from understanding the source side of it, the destination side had to be looked at. And so when we built migration tracking system, the fundamental, and I'll really shorten this for everybody, because I don't think I have so much time. The fundamental of migration tracking system was to shift this narrative from a demand-based service delivery system to a government that was proactively looking for people and saying that, for the vulnerable section, we would provide portability and we would reach out to migrants, instead of them telling us that give us services. So when an entry was made in migration tracking system, the data would auto migrate from source to destination. And the destination knows before the source, the person goes there, that they are coming here. They get details by which they can reach out to a beneficiary, or they know that this person has already come here, so they can proactively reach out and provide service. One of the things I want to point out here is that our field workers, when I used to speak with Anganwadi workers and doctors, they were really keen on giving service also. It was not that we had financial issues, or that packet nahi aa rahe hain ya SAM ko dekh nahi sakte. The issue was information asymmetry, and they would say, we don't know where migrants are, and migrants would know, we don't know where institutions are. So what we tried to fix was actually a very simple implementation problem, which was information asymmetry. And then we said that, okay, let's try to fix this. I'll stop here for now and take questions.
Mitali, this is great. I think we'll wait for questions a little bit later. But what reminded, when you were speaking, what I was reminded of was the fact that a large number of women go to their natal homes for delivery. Okay? Yeah. And service delivery is sort of focused around starting in the first trimester, registering women for hospital delivery and going forward. And yet it's abruptly broken as they go home to their parents' home for delivery. So that mismatch is very much like the kind of mismatch that you were talking about. Okay? And it's much more widespread than the large migration areas. Okay? Our next panelist is Chinmay Tumbe. Chinmay is Associate Professor in Economics at IIM Ahmedabad. He is very well known for an amazing book on migration called India Moving. It's one of the easiest to read and yet dense with a lot of information. It's a great book. So Chinmay, every time I have read this book, and I've read it several times, I actually wondered how you managed to get some of the data. What were the data gaps that you observed? What is your sense in terms of building up a database for future research on migration?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, firstly. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I've been working on migration now for 15 years as a researcher. And very early on in my PhD itself, I realized that you can't rely on one database, because there's just so many variations and so many types. So one is looking at the macro level, like the census. One is what Mitali just pointed out at the field level. So I think the first thing that anyone who wants to understand migration in India has to connect both of these things. The macro kind of data that's emerging from the national sample surveys, the surveys you've done, and the census, the three main large databases, with actual field studies. And there's a lot of field studies out there by various researchers across India. The good news at some level is that some of these data sets are very congruent. So we know that there's a lot of seasonal migration from certain hamlets, certain districts, especially in the Deccan region. We know there's a lot of out-migration from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh of a very different kind. One of the things I learned in this process is, of course, the categorization. And an important categorization is the duration. How long are people going out for? Now, the National Sample Survey, for instance, has the 2007-8, so again, we're talking of data which is very old, had for the first time actually collected very valuable data on both in migration and out migration. So they're not only so what the census gives you is how many people at the destination. You can really not back out how many people are going out from the source region. And what was really interesting is that across these surveys, National Sample Survey and many other surveys, the number of out migrants that you get when you have a specific question that, how many people are outside your house for work or for marriage is much, much more than in migrants. So you find this real, in theory, all in migrants should equal to out migrants. Of course, in fact, in migrants are usually more because at the source region, entire households could move out, in which case they won't be captured in the out migration. As it turns out, whether you look at the Kerala migration survey done by the CDS, and I'll just give you this one example. We know there's a lot of migration from Kerala to the Gulf. When surveys have asked people in Kerala, what is your last residence? Everyone says, Kerala is my home, right? But they spend 20 years outside. So they're not picked up as migrants or even return migrants. And that's the issue with a large chunk of migration in India, which is essentially circular. So if you look at a census, how many people are in Surat from, say, northern Maharashtra or Orissa, it's a really tiny number. But when you go to the source region and ask, how many people from this place and another place, you get a much larger number. So that's the first thing I'd like to say, that, any good migration survey or data collections exercise has to have questions on out migration apart from in migration. And most surveys, even the periodic labor force survey, which has recent information, gets you only that. Second, as you pointed out, migration is very corridor based. And these corridors can be very long duration. I mean, the out migration of UP Bihar is for more than 100 years. In which case, again, these census or the national sample surveys do not really tell you these corridors at the district level. Like you mentioned, Jaunpur and Mumbai connection, you'll get in the census data how many people from Mumbai are in the UP, from UP. But you don't really have important information. And this was never really seen as a problem until the COVID-19 affair of massive migration, where people wanted these links. So just to give you an example, the Uttar Pradesh government wanted to know how many migrants from UP are there in Gujarat. The data is 10 years old. The data was about 1 million people from UP. If you project it from 2011 to 2021, that number would be 15 million, even if you took a high growth rate. During COVID, nobody really believed these numbers. So Gujarat government did an internal survey just to find out. And they came up with the number 3.2 million, right? So you have 1 to 1.5 million what the census is telling you. And when they did a focus survey, how many people need to go back, they got a number like 3.2. So the numbers are really, I would say in some states it's very good. Over time they've done a good job, like Kerala, for instance. But the overall framework, do we know how many people are going from one place to another and at what duration? That's the key challenge that is required at the policy making level, which is clearly not in place. And I think immediately after the COVID-19 migration crisis, there was a lot of buzz on migration. Unfortunately, now what's happened in the next 3 years is that the buzz on migration is for a completely different reason, what you would call as nativist concern. Virtually every state government across political parties now want privatization. I mean, they want laws put in place saying 80% of workers, in some places even corporate sector, should be reserved for locals and so on. So the buzz earlier was to get data for policy making, portability, and so on. The buzz now is, unfortunately, how many migrants are there in a state, so that we can define these cutoffs and not have these migrants or give opportunities to others. So these are some of the debates that coming out with the numbers. Another point I make is on circular migration, because that's hugely in the news, and there's a massive underestimation of that in the census, like I just pointed out in this chart. What is the best way to measure circular migration? It's most likely through micro efforts. You're not going to really tap into any way. So efforts like what Mitali is doing, you really need these efforts, or efforts like Ajivika Bureau, which is an NGO, where they register people both in the source and destination region. Typically, surveys point out 6 months is the definition of short-term migration. The NSS 2008 says, okay, how many migrants from this region are in another region for purposes of seasonal migration, and then they count how many spells, because people sometimes go for 3 months in one location. So that's also another thing. Duration of migration, how many times you're moving in a year. I feel short-term seasonal migration. There's semi-permanent migration, like the security guards in the cities who are there in the city for about 10 months, go back typically during the monsoon, and then come back after 2 months. That's also a huge number of migrants belong to that. And then there are the really short-term seasonal migrants. And folks like me who are now in Ahmedabad for like 7 years, we would be counted as permanent migrants, though even though you make changes across your time. So the 1 year definition, 1 year cutoff for the permanent migrant, the 6 month broadly for a short term works, but you need more kind of granularity in that. You want to know exactly where they're going district to district, not just state to state, because migration is so hard. I'll end with just a few slides to show some of the maps that have been generated on this, and also end with some of the new data sources, because as we were all discussing, 2007 NSS, which I think is the best database on migration, then 2011 census. And for many places now, maybe we don't need these large databases. We, I think, are gathering good information at the shortest level. So I'm just going to share one slide. Yeah, can you see this?
Yes.
Right. So this is a map which has been generated from the NSS 2007 data. I think it's a fairly useful map. It's basically showing the red shaded districts where people are going out for work. So it's not counting managed migration, which is a huge component. I mean, almost all migration by definition is managed migration. And the circles out there are what's not captured typically in data. And that's coming from either the seasonal migration side or from field surveys. And I think that's one way of understanding migration, plotting the base macro data. And again, I'm saying this is 15 years old. We need a survey like this again. You'll see that West Bengal has much more out migration today, a lot going to Kerala and so on. But one way of understanding migration is to use very basic data. Now, this is from the Census and National Sample Survey, but I'll also point out a few other ways of looking at migration. This is ideally what we need. We need a district-to-district mapping. And the last time we could do this was in the 1990s. So this is about 25 years old data, but it shows you, for example, how people are going across India to Mumbai. So you can see Mumbai drawing in people at the district level across India. And I think that's a very powerful way of understanding this. For example, Delhi and so on. The census gives you these numbers on rural to urban or rural to rural dynamics, but it's really not. This is again, a huge underestimate. Interestingly, it shows that rural to urban migration is the same as urban to urban migration, which is really hard to believe. This is what the census is pointing out. International migration also important. There's actually a daily ticker on how many people leave India and how many people come back. And the difference is basically typically people moving out of India. But these are new sources of data which can give you a sense of mobility at the daily level. People have looked at the One Nation, One Ration Card data. Again, very useful. You can actually map out a lot of migration. The only problem is that right now, nobody's really using the One Nation, One Ration Card. Almost all of it is Delhi-based. About 70% of the data suggests that Delhi has been using it, and UP and Bihar are going to, people are going to them. So you really can't talk about Maharashtra and other states because the offtake right now is a huge challenge. During COVID, of course, we had the Google Mobility Tracker, which is very useful, but this is now being shut down. And researchers are looking at mobile phone data, not in terms of at the individual level, but a very simple way, because we have roaming attached to the the telecom body of India actually gives you monthly data on how many people move from Delhi to UP or how many people move from at different states. So this has been used by researchers of late. I'm going to skip these slides. So just to summarize, should definitions also be harmonized across surveys? I don't think that's as much valuable as fundamentally doing two things: understanding migration at both the source and the destination region, classifying by duration, and getting it at the district to district. I think those are the three components which will really give us a much better understanding of migration. Unfortunately, much of what I've shown is also 15 or 10 years old, and that's a major challenge in understanding migration at the macro. Thanks.
Chinmay, this is fascinating, and I'm particularly struck by your comment about measuring migration at origin rather than destination, because almost all our data collection is household-based data collection, yet migrants don't always live in the households. Like, they are in a taxi, they're sleeping on the taxi stands, they're in maybe working women's hostels. So capturing those migrants at destination may be a lot harder than sort of catching them from the origin. Reshma?
Yes, so next we'll hear from Dr. Chandrasekhar, who is a professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. He is a leading expert in internal migration in India, as well as issues of urbanization and labor. He led the initiative Strengthen and Harmonize Research and Action on Migration in the Indian Context, or Shramik, which is an online knowledge community on migration that highlights work by NGO partners. So Professor Chandrasekhar, two questions for you. One is, what are the lessons that can be learned from the work of civil society organizations in the context of migration, and what can really be taken forward for the purposes of defining and measuring internal migration. And secondly, this has just come up in Dr. Dumbe's talk, that there is a rural to urban bias when we speak of internal migration. And this could be because we as researchers or policymakers or journalists are sitting in cities, and rural to rural migration is often left out of the policy narrative. And so can you also speak to this issue from a data perspective and also a labor rights perspective?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this webinar. I'm reminded of this song, and I'm not going to sing it, trust me, which went as Chodo kal ki baatein, kal ki baat purani, naye daur mein likhenge, milkar nayi kahani. The point is, we always knew migration existed. We somehow forgot. It required a COVID to basically remind you that we have migrant workers. Now, the point is, what is the nahi kahani which we are actually going to talk about? Okay, before I started interacting with the civil society organization, I thought the most important thing was data. I love data. It helps me write a paper. But the point is, if you really want to understand migration, data is not the issue. And it's no point all of us agreeing that data is a problem. So I'm going to take a contrarian view here so that there's some plurality of views. What did I learn? I learned that it's about processes. The civil society organizations and the district administration, the panchayats, know a lot about what is exactly happening. And I think officers like Dr. Sethi and the other IAS and IPS officers have done an excellent job of working with civil society organizations once they have highlighted that such a problem exists. Now, Dr. Sethi talked about it, Chinmay talked about it. I think we have made some progress in terms of understanding how to handle education. In Orissa, they actually run seasonal hostels to ensure children don't drop out. There have been interventions at the destination. One good example is the Rachakonda example in Telangana, where migrants from Orissa and Maharashtra are actually taught in the native language. So I think civil society has a very, very important role in making the issue visible. I think that's the important thing. On health, yes, we are talking about portability in terms of like portability of the health insurance. And on food, we have the one nation, one ration card. So I really think that we are in a position to address the issue of education, the issue of portability of health, and also portability of food. At least we have the architecture in place to actually do it. If you read the Right to Education Act, it actually tries to protect the rights of the migrant children. Again, in all of this, the civil society organization, the panchayats and the district administration exactly know what is happening. So for me, data is not a problem. So that's my first point. The second point that I want to make is, how do you make it visible? So this government takes the Employment Provident Fund EPFO data, and they put out this data periodically to saying so many jobs actually created. Now, if we want to make the invisible visible, my observations are the following. You have the one nation, one ration card. You have the data. Can the government every month put out data saying that, look, so many people from this region actually availed in the same district, in another district of the state, and in another state? So, look, I'm just saying, can we show that this one nation, one ration card is actually working? Chinmay said that this is a Haryana, Delhi story. I mean, we have to keep, ek hi baat humko baar-baar dohrana hai for it to be successful. Okay. So the thing is, if you, with the EPFO data, at least we are talking about how many jobs created. You might like the indicator, you might not like the indicator, but at least we've started a conversation. The second thing is, along with this data put out every month, how many NREGA jobs were actually created by state, by district, because that's an indicator of push. Third, what was the thing that's repeatedly litigated? It is the BOCW. The Supreme Court has also said the state governments are not spending money. It took COVID to basically for everybody to realize that there was 55,000 crores, there was a PIB release. I will not go into the details of which state registered how many BOCW workers. It was embarrassingly low. But what if we got into this habit of saying every month by district, how many workers are registered under BOCW? There's a list of items under which they can actually get the benefit and how many actually got the benefit. Similarly, on health. In case of education, Orissa government, I have visited some of the seasonal hostels there. In Maharashtra, it's a little bit more difficult to run the seasonal hostels because you need a big enough school if the entire village is actually going to disappear. So there are some implementation issues there. If you look at the annual work plan that every state government submits, it has something for migrant children and out-of-school children. So they have an estimate of the number. So how about putting that number out once a year? The other interesting thing, I know we are all caught up in this whole issue of workers. The other issue that no one's really talking about is like migration for education. We are having people who have finished class 12, going and living in hostels. Even the NSS data picks this phenomenon up. If you look at the national NIRF data, it tells you for every college, every university, how many out-of-state students. With CUET coming in, I don't know how this migration pattern on education is actually going to change. There are really worse off regions in terms of access to educational facilities, and there are some well-off regions. This, again, migration for education is as important a phenomenon as the workers in the unorganized sector. And this brings me to my last point, which is that what is this Nahi Kahani we are interested in? If you go and read, we talk about 100 days Narega employment, right? The first time I actually found a reference to 100 days employment was actually in the third 5-year plan. India conducted the first agriculture labor inquiry. It showed that 100 days was the slack season in agriculture. And the third 5-year plan has the wording is eerily similar to Narega. Read the successive 5-year plans. They're ambivalent on what we want to do about migration. Let's admit, what's the Nahi Kahani I'm talking about? Let's admit that we are one country, we are one nation, we can't have 700 odd segmented labor markets. Let's agree on that first point. For me, that is the Nahi Kahani. The second point, if you read the questionnaire, the answers that have been given at Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, you have two different ministries giving completely opposite answers. We can't have two ministries of the government of India giving two different answers on migration. So that has to be the Nahi Kahani where we say that, look, I'm going to acknowledge that migration actually is happening. And the Nahi Kahani is about the entire conversation will be driven by civil society organizations. Don't expect the statistical system to give you data on a periodic basis in terms of what's happening in terms of migration. The PLFS data gives you some numbers. It tells you about the patterns in terms of, is it rural to rural urban migration or rural to urban or urban to urban? I know the question was asked was on rural to urban. We don't even understand urban to urban. We are too focused on rural to urban. We don't understand anything about urban to urban, and we don't understand rural to rural. And do I have an answer to that? Everybody knows that rural to rural migration happens. If you go and look at the movies, Hindi movies before 2000, they did an excellent job of portraying reality. Nowadays, the regional movies actually do it. Describing economic reality somehow has gone out of fashion in the Hindi movies. And there was a story that many of us probably read in school by Premchand. It was called Poos Ki Raat. Nothing's really changed since Premchand wrote Poos Ki Raat in 1920 or 1921. In that sense. So we kind of know why migration happens. And my last thing is, I'll just take 30 more seconds. Ambedkar talked about industrialization in 1910. 1930, Vishveshwaraya and Ambedkar spoke about industrialization. Ambedkar said that, look, you need to fix the problem of small land holdings. So the issue is, I need to intervene at the source in terms of improving livelihoods. But the new kahani has to be that I'm not intervening to stop migration. I am intervening to improve livelihoods. And I think that has to be the conversation. The conversation has to be about the process. Let's move away from the data. The civil society organizations are providing the evidence. And just the way you bring out the EPFO data and say, this is where the job market is going. Use the One Nation, One Ration card, NREGA data, BOCW data, health data. Put this out every month. That's how we make the invisible visible. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so moving on to migration and gender, we'll turn to Dr. Neeta, who is a professor at the Center for Women's Development Studies. She is an expert in female labor migration, women workers in the informal sector, domestic workers, and gender statistics. Her most recently edited book is entitled Migration, Gender, and Care Economy. So Professor Neeta, according to official data sources, the great majority of women migrate for marriage. This also just came up. And we're all aware of the limitations in these data sources in terms of capturing the complexities of the motivations of women's movement. And you've written extensively on this topic. So can you speak to the challenges of measuring women's labor migration, both unaccompanied female labor migration and also when women migrate to marry as well as to work?
Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Let me start by saying, I think data is very important because it is lack of credible data that why female labor migration has not got any attention in policy making. If you look at any sources of macro data, as already flagged, marriage is the main reason. If you look at the recent PLFS data, 90% is reporting marriage as a reason for migration. And I think census had a better sense of labor migration. It had only around 66 or 70%, less than 70% migrating for marriage. So marriage is actually the main reason that's given by all the data sources for female migration, which is why female labor migration has been neglected in policy making. And why is this? Because all the macro data sources on migration has only one question in terms of the reason for migration, allows the participants to give only one reason for their migration. And given the social context that we are in, marriage is assumed to be the main reason. And if there are provisions to enter more than one reasons for migration, surely employment is going to be one of the reasons that we may get in such surveys. And this was very clear in the CWDA survey that we did that we did a survey in 20 states and also in some sectors. So I think that's the main issue. It is time that, though this has been pointed out for many years, there has been no change in terms of how the data is collected from the field. So because of that, female labor migration has been left out in terms of any policy debate and policy discussion. So if you look at it, if you look at any statistics on labor migration, a common statement that people make is that, and I'm just quoting, nearly 9 out of 10 women migrants move for reasons related to marriage. In contrast, half of the male migrants move for work-related reasons. So which means out of 10, 5 male migrants. But it is important for us to also to note, with all the questions of invisibility of women's migration, female labor migration, it's important for us to note that 10 for women is 48% of the all female population. Whereas for men, that 5 is only 11% of the total male population. So you have two different denominators. And if you look at, even though the data is not very good in terms of capturing female labor migration, the number of women who are labor migrants are not negligible. And it is important for us to consider that. But when you picture, when you give the data as reasons, because it's 80-90%, you just neglect female labor migration. And that has been the pattern that we have seen. And even when women migrate for marriage, supposedly marriage, I think it's important to look at how marriage is, in a sense, bringing in labor migration, because the ability of the women to perform household functions, and also may work in agriculture farms or any other household, employment, household enterprises or any other kind of economic opportunities that are there, is also equally important. So, it's not just that we just ignore female labor migration. Then we have another category which is called associational migration or moving with the family. And here I think it is important for us because, when I was working among domestic workers, some of them who have moved with families, they have said it is associational migration. Whereas, even in that context, the possibility of women to get employment or being absorbed in the labor market is a consideration for the family to move. But that is not captured at all. So associational migration also needs to be looked at differently. And it is important for us to note that and may have more data to see what is associational migration. And doing the CWDA study, we have come across family units or male-female pairs in specific sectors like bricklines and also in cane cutting. So these are sectors where the male member becomes a male unit of migration, whereas the family is actually moving with the male migrant. And female workers' contribution, females' contribution to the actual work is very important. And because otherwise they won't get employment. Men also will not get employment. So it is important to understand in these kinds of associational migration to specific sectors, it could be actually women's capacity to do work or perform labor, which is why it is an economic contribution. That's why women are moving with men. And even if we look at migration data, migration for housework and care work is completely ignored. And we know in the cities, there are many parents, many grandparents who move to the cities or urban areas for childcare and other related care functions. So, that's also not even acknowledged or, discussed in any context. And Chinmay has already talked about types of migration, temporary, permanent, different kinds of migration. But I think it's the domination of the understanding of migration as permanent settlement migration is an issue. And this is especially true in the context of female labor migrants, because a lot of them are short-term, what we called in our CWD's data, in our CWD survey, medium-term migrants who may migrate to the cities or urban areas or to any other rural area, not for permanent settlement, but have fixed number of years, like women moving to government work, to take up government work. They may be not going to be in the industry for a longer time, but maybe there only for a few years. So they don't have a plan to settle in the place of their destination, but very well have a plan to return back and may get married and move on to different kinds of work or may not join the labor market. So I think it is important for female labor migration. Some of these categories have to be looked at closely. And I think the data could provide some insights, but if there are additional questions canvassed in the questionnaire. So that is, as far as female labor migration is concerned, it is important to have a greater recognition for different types of temporary migration, and these should be there incorporated in the concepts and definitions that are adopted by the macro data sources. A type of migration is, as I said, is closely related to sectors. So we know gender labor market is something that we know that exists in our context, and there are concentrations. In the CWD survey, because of these concentrations, and we knew that some of the migrants would be left out, as Chinmay has already said, in the source areas, we actually selected specific sectors where we knew that there is concentration. So we selected in urban area, the survey in the urban areas was basically sector-based. So we looked at specific sectors where female migration and labor migration is higher. So, and I think that's a way to go about if one has to look at female migration across sectors and to capture female labor migration better. So I think it is important that we include specific sectors in rural and urban areas. In rural areas, it could be bricklines, it could be sugar cutting, it could be cotton picking. These are segments where women rural to rural migration is very high. And also rural to urban migration, sectors like paid domestic work, garment making, and the vending. These are sectors we found concentration of women. So, and there were other sectors that we surveyed, we found that there was some diversification. We had a mix of, there was not a clear domination of migrants, but there was a mix of migrants and non-migrant workers. And another issue is about proxy reporting. If you are interviewing a household head, and it is very important in the context of capturing independent autonomous migration. If you are, surveying the household, the head of the household, we know how, given the larger patriarchal system that is prevailing, especially if it is a single girl who is migrating, the household may not report that. And this we actually found in our own surveys. And because there's a sexual stigma attached to single female migration, especially among the class that that large scale migration happened for domestic work, and also because the whole discourse around trafficking that has recently been there, and the NGO intervention in these pockets have actually meant that people are not wanting to share migration of their young girls to cities, in different ways. So that's also an issue that we have, the proxy reporting system that we have in space. And the main question is about the details and specificities of migration patterns, employment relationship, contractor, and the understanding is that what is applicable to male migration is applicable to female migration, which is actually not correct. The channels of migration, the manner of migration, the dependence on the contractor, who is the contractor, there are changes, there are differences between men and women. But in what we do by just looking at labor migration as such as a larger issue, we tend to ignore these fundamental differences between male and female migration. And for that, I think that some of the data, some of the additional questions to the existing data sources could give a broader picture. And it's very important to have that at this stage. I think I'll stop here because I must have.
No, Nita, this is really fascinating. And I was just thinking that one additional area of sort of thinking about migration in women is also that women often end up, given the solo male migration that happens from so many areas of India, women are also sort of at times left behind, wives who are taking up the labor slack, right? So there is a sort of the whole issue around the work that men used to do, which now women do in the areas of origin. So that's another area of sort of linkage, which we might want to pay attention to. Our next panelist is Rajni Palriwala. Rajni is a sociologist. She taught at Delhi University in sociology department. She was head of the department. At one point, she was dean of social sciences. And she has written extensively on gender, family, and migration in a variety of settings. Rajni, I think that one of the areas, though, while women's labor migration remains very important, the marriage migration is also a very big part of women's lives, which it's not just that they migrate in order to get married. There is also a whole set of kinship patterns and social norms that evolve around women's marriage migration. So could you tell us a little bit about, how should we think about the marriage migration? Is it something we see as sort of normal part of growing up, or is it something that requires some explicit thinking from a policy perspective? Up to you. Thank you. You need to unmute yourself, Rajni.
Sorry, didn't unmute myself, which is just as well because I was getting a. No, but thank you, Shunalde, for inviting me to this. And I've actually been fascinated hearing what everyone has to say. Lots of new ideas and thinking which is coming up. And I sort of feel that now what I have to say, to some extent, I think Nita has covered a lot of what I wanted to say, and also what some of the others have said. So, I should start off by saying that I am not a large data person in terms of data collection. though one does draw on large data sets, often just to give the background, saying, okay, now this is the background and here's where I'm going to take off from. So most of the data I have worked with, other than the qualitative, even the quantitative has been ethnographically driven. And again, how did I come to be looking at migration at all? It actually started donkeys years ago when I was doing my PhD. And I realized how migration was changing and affecting gender relations in rural Rajasthan. Often, we think things are terrible, were terrible, but one saw how migration was actually making things, lessening the control which women may have had. More recently, it was actually in terms of issues around care and migration, which one was looking at. And when one was looking at how migration both enabled or derogated family caregiving or receiving. So it's from these sorts of vantage points that I'm going to talk. But, and initially I thought, oh, I will be taking a step back and essentially asking questions, but I've realized these are actually questions which others have already raised over here. And, the first question which you indicated also was that how do we define a migrant? Okay. Is it somebody who's moved as a child, or only as somebody who's moved from as an adult, only when they moved from their place of birth? These issues have already come up. And this particularly becomes relevant when we look at how marriage migration is talked of. As you pointed out, particularly in North India and Central India, and particularly amongst Hindus in principle and in practice, and amongst Muslims in practice, and amongst South Indian Hindus also, and even amongst matrilineal communities, young women move out of their natal localities on marriage. Okay, whether it's the village locality or the mohalla locality, it's less the case amongst Adivasis. So it is integral to their regular life cycle for the majority of women in the country. And what I would say is that rather than see migration and the normal part of growing up as two sort of separate, contradictory elements, yes, migration is the normal part of growing up, but I'll come to it later. If one broadens the way we look at migration, we would see that actually it's the normal part of most of the people in our society. I mean, in any case, all the women I've indicated who move on marriage are forming a huge number. And I would say that then when we come to look at research questions or policy, movement and migration, we should take as the normal, as the normality, as what actually we should be starting from rather than stasis. Now, another aspect which comes when we're looking at marriage migration is how do we define natal community? What is the natal community? Is it those in and around where the person who is now named a migrant grew up? Okay, because when you look at some short-term or long-term migrants who still see themselves as migrants, but the children now see that as their home. How do we look at them? Are they just children of migrants? Are they migrants? There's that issue which comes up. Is it the caste community we are talking about or the religious community? And I mention these because a lot of the focus is on long distance marriage migration, where it's assumed that maybe people are married out of their religious or caste community, and which they might try and hide. So what is community? Is it the community which has moved as a group to the brick kilns? So, or is it the community that the migrant moves into? Is it just the ascriptive community? Now, this becomes very important, I think, when we are looking at migration, because migration is, of course, not just a geographical move. Migration is about moving to new ways of living, new cultures around you, new rites and rituals. And in India, where when you do ethnographic work, and even if you don't, if you're just going for a wedding somewhere, people will say that, oh, amongst us, we do it like this. And the us is just, one side of the two parties who are engaged in the marriage. People talk about, I mean, in Rajasthan, it was very clear that they would say ki 10 कोस में सब कुछ बदल जाता है. It's about, that's 15 to 20 kilometers, everything has changed. So what do we take then as the moving out of and the moving into? And of course, what this is pointing to is that we must not make the mistake. I find very often people sort of think of marriage migration at one level as just being the long distance marriage migrants who are problematic. Then we come to the point which Neeta raised, which is how is the purpose of migration to be named? As everyone has commented, women actually form the bulk of migrants in India if we go by whether it's 2011 census or other censuses, by most measures, because they are living for years away from the place they were born. And what goes along with that then is there's a tendency to assume that women migrants, all women migrants are marriage migrants. And I think, again, I'll go through this quickly because Neeta's elaborated on it. Even those who move primarily for marriage, women, are desired for their labor in the home and in the home enterprises. Again, you talk to people and they are saying, beto ko ghar bandhno hai. What does that mean? We have to settle our sons. But what does that mean? We have to get them married because there has to be that female labor which is going to be helping not just run the home, but in the field. And here, even if we don't even include those who subsequently move with men in paid work and who then are part of paid work or enabling men to be in paid work, what we come to is that the reason for marriage is actually work. It's children and work. So if you're going to look at what the reason is, labor is very much part of it. So how, in a sense, the question has come up, how do we get data which guards against the assumption that women's migration is for marriage and that marriage is not about labor? How do we ensure that those two domains don't collapse? Because even when you do ethnographic work, these ideas are so strong that, I mean, even if you just ask at a small survey level, these ideas are so firm that people will, women, again, as we've heard, they'll say, yeah, we moved for marriage. It's only when you do ethnographic work and you spend more time that you get an elaboration of what that marriage itself means, both for women and their families. The other point which I've already indicated and which has come up is women are the most mobile in India. Okay? And not only because they move on marriage, but because they continue moving. They don't, it's not just associational migration, which is very important, as Neeta's pointed out, but women are pulled back and forth between natal home and marital home, between where the source place and the destination place, in order to keep families going. It's for work, domestic work, care work, as and when it crops up, they will go there. And, the usual ways in which you will, migration studies looks at it is like, oh, is it one-step migration, two-step migration, first generation migration, second generation migration? This is seasonal migration taken to an extreme, okay? Women are going back because the sister-in-laws to have a child. Women are going back because there's a big event and they have to go and do all the work. Women are going back because somebody's ill and the daughter in many places can go and work in the fields, whereas a daughter-in-law cannot. So what it emphasizes again is the point I made earlier, that mobility rather than stasis is the normal state of life here. And that actually it is women's movements from which we get an idea of how social relations, gender relations, social relations, familial relations, migration, all of them can actually work. And you know, when Chandrasekhar said it's the process, it is the process which is in a different way, I want to point out. It is the process of everyday life, of social life, which we see over here. One more point over here, which one can make, women are perhaps the only, women who move on marriage are perhaps the only people who are moving, who are migrating, who hope that their movement will be permanent. Otherwise, what studies show again and again is, you know, the Kerala study where people have lived forever elsewhere, but they say they're here, but otherwise also, people who've been in Delhi for 20 years, 30 years, in Hyderabad for 20 years, 30 years, and all talk of how they will be going back, they will be moving back, and slowly only recognizing that they will not be moving back. So what is it? Is it the person's perception of themselves as a migrant, which we will then say they are migrants or not? Or is it a certain number of years? And why this is important is it also affects then the way in which they relate to the state machinery. We all know how, I mean, there's been a lot of work done about how people, even when they are migrants, know that for them to access any sort of government facilities, they have to accumulate documents. They work very hard at accumulating those documents, you know, whether it's the Aadhaar, the ration card, people who never pay income tax in their lives, they all have PAN cards. So all this goes on, but what it also means is that because of their idea that they will move back, they fear to lose the documentation also back in the villages, in the other cities they've come from. And this is not an easy problem to solve because, okay, one nation, one ration card is supposed to stop the fix of people having double ration cards and collecting double rations. But then if some of them actually finally move back, there is a problem. There is another problem because the woman may remain there and the husband may have gone off to work elsewhere. Is he going to be then without access to PDS in the city because the ration card will be in the rural area where the wife or the mother remains with the children looking after them? Or in seasonal migration, that may be a more easy resolvable problem. Okay, you've got your ration card, the whole family's here, you will all get ration here. But what happens with these split families over there, where the idea of permanent migration is also such a fear? Okay, coming very quickly to sort of policy concerns. And here I'll have to move a little from what I've been saying. But one of the issues which we constantly see is that women's marriage migration becomes a rationale used by natal families to deny them fixed property, especially land. How is that going to be addressed? How is the right of, and I've indicated, women's right to the ration card also to be addressed? How is her being the person on the move not to become the reason to remove her rights? And again, one of the things which we saw, it came up, for example, at the anti-CA rallies at that time. Women after migration very often do not have any papers. Okay? They don't have birth certificates any longer, even if they ever had it. There is a very easy way in which they will get cancelled where they are. So how do their rights in these different places, the place of birth, the place of marriage, the place where they have subsequently moved to, how do they get access to? And here what we have to remember is that given Patriviri local residents, that it's the women that move, the social and kinship networks and links they don't have in the same way as the men have when they move with the patrilineal ideas which exist. So these are not issues which are to be addressed with data. Data might tell us that there is this sort of issue, but data tells us there is this migration matter, and that then women have this issue, and it has to be addressed. It's a gender issue which comes up very sharply. And the last issue over here, which I'll touch on, because I think other issues of portability have been taken up, but which really comes up, and Mitali mentioned this about the Anganwadis. Okay, so the migrant women, especially seasonal migrant women, those who are supposedly associational migrants, get into work, but they can't get to creches. And it's for two reasons. There may be no Anganwadis around them. They may not know them. The Anganwadis which are there are already full. They are not accepted as having rights. And as we know, all the measures which are supposed to be there around construction workers, etc., you know, whether it's the welfare fund or whatever, creches also aren't there. So this is, I think, a policy area which really needs to be focused on, and where we can say, look, women are on the move. They are migrants. They are constantly moving. So that cannot be a reason not to have creche facilities everywhere, saying because women will move. It becomes a reason to argue you have to have creche facilities everywhere, even if there are only 3 who might access them initially. Okay, that's what will then enable more to access them. And the property issue, I don't know how to immediately address it, but obviously it's an issue for a huge campaign, but it's also to be addressed in terms of women's access to the law. Because when they try and access it through law, one is, of course, they lose all their social and kinship networks, because anyway, they don't have the networks in the marital home. If they try and access the natal property, they won't have it there. So, of course, the issue which then comes up is that, okay, we can't only talk about natal property. Since women are marriage migrants, can we have marital property rights? We still don't have, women don't have conjugal property rights. And if you're going to say all women are migrants because of marriage, can we have laws giving them that right? Okay, I'll stop. I didn't think I would talk for even so long.
Thank you, Rajni. You know, you raised a lot of connections between care, gender, work, property rights, all of which deserves attention. Before we turn to our next panelist, though, I wanted to tell the audience that if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat box. I will direct them to appropriate panelists, unless you have a specific panelist in mind who you would want to respond. Our next panelist is Udit Misra, who is a senior journalist with Indian Express, where he writes a weekly column titled Explain Speaking. In 2021, in the aftermath of the lockdown and the pandemic, he moderated a series of webinars on India's internal migrants for the newspaper. So taking from that, Udit, can you speak a little bit to the challenges and issues of communicating in media about migration statistics? Okay. What's needed for better understanding of migration in the media? What is needed for communicating some of the challenges facing migrations and migrants to the readership? Please.
Thanks, Sonal. So as a journalist, the best part of my day is over, because these are all the people I would have written emails to ask questions, and I've got a lot of material here. Thanks for inviting me, and I just wanted to start off by anecdote of my own career. I had just started reporting for Mint newspaper in 2007 when it was launched, and I'd shifted from television news because I was bored. And one of the stories that sort of got handed down from, I think, the editor at that time, Raju Narasetti, was that a US think tank has found, I think it was the Population Research Bureau or something, that Delhi is the biggest city in India and not Mumbai, as an urban agglomeration. And what they did was to look at data from 91 census and 2001 census and used a different definition of urban agglomeration and said that Delhi was actually the bigger one. And if I remember correctly in that story, basically said that the population of Delhi as big a population as the actual population of Delhi would walk in or sort of come into Delhi every day and go out. So the pressure on the resources was huge. And so at one level, it was a straightforward story, but I got a call from Sheila Dikshit, who was the chief minister of Delhi that very day. And she said, listen, I want to compliment you on the story. And she was basically bemoaning the fact that nobody listens to us when we go to planning commission or to the central government, that we are facing these challenges. There's no data. There is no understanding of the kind of challenges that administrators face. And you cut to say 2019, when we first had the data from 2011 census, right? And newsrooms were supposed to write a story. And I can tell you very honestly about newsrooms across the board, and it's not just about any one particular newsroom, that the story cycle is very short. Whatever is news at 10 o'clock in the morning may not be news at 3 o'clock. So to say that you have data now coming out of 2011, it really is very difficult for a news organization to say that, okay, let's put in resources behind this, because it's discounted, heavily discounted. But as that anecdote also shows, that it's not just the readers who are flipping through channels or news pages, but it's also the policymakers who actually need this. They are also, frankly, as much in the dark as most of the readers are, and so there is a tremendous need for mass media to actually write on many of these issues. And what we did see through a very unfortunate accident, the whole reverse migration bit, that media was sort of pushed to report on it. Although I would say that there is more reportage in the recent past about one woman shifting from Pakistan to India than the kind of focus that we needed. So it is really unfortunate the way media reacts to these things also. But there are, as you said, the challenges part. One is obviously the timely access to data, timely data, easy access to data, because all of you are experts, and you might look at a database and you might immediately understand how much of it is usable, not usable. But most journalists will not be coming from that background, that kind of an understanding. They may not necessarily even know what part to pick up. So they would need you cannot simply give them raw data or say all the data is uploaded somewhere, right? And they'll just figure out whatever, So you can't even do that. And, when thanks to that whole webinar series, there were many things that I learned about the fact, about the nature and scope of migration in India. The fact that rural to urban is not as big a proportion of total migration, internal migration, or that rural to rural is much bigger, right? Or that 400 million people only migrate within the district or whatever, right? So these things have a massive impact when you finally understand that. Or what is the way how women migrate? What is the motivation there? Or that interstate migration is not as big. We always think about, when we think about migration in the mass media, it's all about interstate. If you didn't change the state, then you really didn't migrate, right? But and also that during that series we realized that when we talk about migrants, I'm a migrant. I'm a Lucknow-born fellow working in Noida. I'm within UP in that sense. I would never honestly say I'm very comfortable outside Lucknow. No Lucknowi will say that, but I was not the audience for that webinar, right? We were not talking, when you and I and Chinmay and everybody were talking, we were not talking about people like us. We were talking about the people we saw through our windows. So now then there comes a problem from the mass media, the challenge part about not just about the access of data and easy access and timely, but also ultimately most of the media is private media. They are looking at an audience. They're looking at subscribers. They're looking at people like us, right? In that sense, this is not the audience. So we are reporting on something. So I'm saying that it's a natural blind spot. It was only a brief period of a tragic accident that happened that we actually looked at that, and it would again close back. That blind spot would largely reappear, and as we have seen, broadly speaking, across the board in media. And now it's again gone back to episodic reporting on, again, what Chinmay said, nativistic tendencies and stories, somebody, even if it's out of rumor, those tend to dominate. But you cannot go back to structural reporting, primarily because there's a capacity issue also. So there is, on the one side, from the media angle, there is an incentives problem. Why should I report on these people? Are they my readers? Do my readers even care for them? And the other bit is on the capacity side. Does Udit Mishra understand that data? Does he have any interest in that, right? And those kind of issues. And then also whether we want to put in the money. So incentives also in that, costs come into play. This is a private media. So, ground reportage, whether that, is something that you can bring out some truth, even, and then look at in context of the data, whatever is available, to see what happened. And I was just seeing a few days back, I was seeing a old series that used to come in Doordarshan called Kirdar. Gulzar used to, I think, direct it. And one episode was what somebody was just mentioning about women being married for labor. That in that one episode, Om Puri's character is very cunning and he says, I will not take dowry, but I'm getting a bahu who works. She's very good at, whatever, painting something, and that will generate X amount of rupees. So he's telling his wife that that's a good. So, what I'm saying is that in the past, maybe in the 80s, your popular media had much greater understanding of why things were happening than mainstream media today. We are not even maybe reporting on those trends because I don't know whether maybe it's because of the growing inequality between the readers or key consumers of news. There is such a huge disparity that there is no common ground. Why should I care about stories of a certain class, which is might be the bigger class in India? But I don't care because, well, my life carries on, and everything is available on Swiggy. So the many such structures, and the last bit is also about the political landscape. As I mentioned, data is now heavily politicized. It perhaps always was, but today even more so. And often these things also, stories on migration can also fall from a reporting perspective. If you do not have a beat reporter on migration, which I don't think anybody in India would have, no media organization has a beat reporter on migration, where they develop sources and talk and understand, and they themselves become somebody to reckon with because they understand and they track it and report. This also falls in the center state kind of a thing, So if something happened, do I report it because it's a Jharkhand story or a Haryana story? If it's a Haryana story, I might report it because it's close to my audience right now, Delhi. If it's a Jharkhand story, I may not report it. And how do I report it? And it's also the media landscape in India, which is still, I think, evolving, where you have big media houses which are stationed in Delhi and Mumbai and such big cities, but we don't have a UP paper, right? Which is intrinsically a UP paper, which sort of then goes out and reports like that. So it is the responsibility of the Delhi papers to sort of report on UP, but then they have to figure out whether this is also a Tamil story or what. So I mean, this is a complicated thing because you don't have a clarity as a media organization of what your purpose is. If I'm a Lucknow Post, then I'm reporting like that for UP. And my audience is there, and my feasibility, my financial feasibility is all coming from that. But how many UP papers or Madhya Pradesh papers can say, well, I will survive only on Madhya Pradesh business? No, it won't happen. So it's a fairly complicated set of reasons why media often overlooks, and sadly it does, and we don't really do ourselves any favor on that. So yeah, I think you might be short on time, so I'm also trying to finish it quickly.
Udit, this is fantastic. I loved the series that you had coordinated because it allowed for a lot of in-depth conversation. But the last point that you made, that migration is sort of a local issue when it comes for newspapers. The fact of the matter is, though, that the one thing that links migrants to the both destination and origin is the issue of remittances, which we haven't talked about much. I remember the 15th Finance Commission actually was looking for data on remittances as it was trying to deal with some of the allocation issues, and it couldn't find it. Okay, so there was hardly any data on remittances. So in some sense, a lot of these pieces are linked together. And we have a number of questions in the chat box, which are really interesting. There is one that I'm going to just direct to Chandrasekhar to answer it on by typing, if you can. There is a question about source of data on educational migration, if you can just respond to it online. But let me direct some of the other questions. There is one from Mr. Shinde to Dr. Mitali, which says that, he would like to know a little more about definition of migration in your work on seasonal migrants.
Yes, so Digvijay was actually part of our team that upscaled the Mailghut system to Maharashtra migration tracking system. So for us, the seasonality of migration was actually defined by the benefits that we were going to give to the vulnerable population. And I think for us, the entire idea was to not get trapped into perfectionism. So we said, okay, let's target people for whom we have implementation issues, and in policy, the portability is inbuilt. So for example, for migration tracking system, we don't look at males. We don't look at people who don't get any benefit out of the system. We are looking at only people for whom systems are already portable, but they are not able to avail the system. The second thing we are doing in MTS is that we are building corridors and we are trying to understand where is this out migration happening from. So because our benefits were going once a month, so THR and all of the Anganwadi benefits or the vaccination happens once a month, we defined seasonal migration to be anything that was over a month. So because, and we had a lot of challenges because like Chinmay pointed out, the categorization of the industry and the kind of migration that happens is challenging, is very complicated. So for example, when we looked at sugar industry, we were looking at brick kiln because I was looking at brick kiln where the migration was for 6 to 7 months at one place. So the family would move and they would stay at one place, easy for the government worker to, once they find out, that, this person is staying there, there's a relationship between Anganwadi worker and or the PHC or the Anganwadi worker. But what do you do when in Nandurbar, there is migration for sugar factories and where people move every 15 days? How do you build a system that gives them portability? So there we realized that, once they get benefits, it should be noted down somewhere and should be tagged as a local data point in our system so that the next time that person, no matter where the person is, once that tag is open, they would be able to look at the fact that when was the last service provided to this person. And so therefore, because our system is oriented towards service delivery, the data is a lateral consequence of what we are doing. We were not doing something to get data. So I think that's a major difference in what we were doing. Just want to take a minute and like Udit pointed out, the rural urban migration in our data set for the pilot that we ran in 6 districts was only 4%. The rest of the migration was actually rural to rural. And it's a huge data that, we are not looking at in terms of migration. And the heuristic part where Udit mentioned that, or somebody else, that we look at rural to urban or interstate migration because that's the picture of migration in our head. And so, the heuristic is understanding that is important. Last 2 points. The source is extremely important. Every time we started doing implementation of tracking system, I know a lot of district officers who came and told me, why are you capturing the source? Why can't we just take destination data and provide services? You're just wasting our time. And why do we need to collect source data? Once a migrant is captured on the destination, just note their name and give them services, because that's how service delivery is oriented now. But 2 years of migration tracking system that has run now, and we now have data on the highest out migration villages. These are the places where we need to reorient NREGA, where we need to provide livelihoods, and we need to understand for a district collector, like Chandrasekhar was saying, for a district collector, to me, data is important because for me, the scale is 1,500 villages. And I want to know where is it that I can focus, where is it that I can target a scheme when it comes to me. So to get local data for me is extremely important, and sometimes centralized, not decentralized. Lastly, migration is extremely complicated, complex, and a very customized problem. Nandurbar's migration is not same as Amravati's migration, and probably urban migration is not same as rural migration. These models need to be looked at, and we need to have a focused direction, at least on the level of the state. And if we start in 5, 6, 10 years time, we'll be at a very different level, because if we can just have some focus on what we are doing, we can do wonders with at least portability, and especially the vulnerable or in fact the marriage migration. So we did capture marriage migration, Dr. Desai and Dr. Rajni. We did capture marriage migration. And one of our major learnings was that a lot of women actually move between blocks, and they miss out so much, because interblock migration is something migration hua hi nahi hai. Like it was like तुम तो यहीं से यहीं गए हो, which was तुम्हारा घर यहाँ था और यहाँ ये है, तो हुआ ही नहीं है. So it's extremely important, and I'm so happy to learn from all of you regarding this. Thank you. I'll stop here.
We have focused a lot on the migration of the casual workers. There is a very interesting question, which is, I'm going to throw it, Chinmay. How can changes in work structure, such as work from home, hybrid workplace, freelancing, etc., impact migration, especially for skilled workers?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge talking point during the pandemic. That it's going to completely change everything and so on. But I think around the world, people love to see each other very, very close. So firstly, my sense is, in especially IT companies, skilled, think of Bangalore or something like that. Yes, organizations are giving flexibility, but it is, in my view, not going to fundamentally change anytime soon. Just the sheer need of, in fact, what's happening is, people are going, this is the one thing we've not talked about in some sense, is the urban to rural migration. We've talked of rural to rural, rural to urban, urban to urban, but urban to rural, in the sense of, I've got money, I've got savings built up, this is for the skilled, high income kind of folks, and I'm going to live in a village, not very far, just outside the city, right? So they still want to maintain the close connection in the city. So fundamentally, I don't think it's going to change much. Yes, there are organizations giving more flexibility. But like we saw just after that migration crisis, most people came back, despite the humiliation that many felt. Most people did come. So I don't think this idea that people are just going to leave their employees into, like, the fixed structure to a flexible structure, I don't think that's going to change fundamentally. If it does, yeah, it'll be completely wrong.
Thank you. Chandrasekhar, I'm going to ask you to address a question by Surya Surendran, who asked that use of one nation, one ration card to look at migration pattern is interesting, but will we be able to capture migration of individuals, not families, which is very common for daily wage labor migration? Okay.
So when I mentioned the one nation, one ration card, or the BOCW, or any of these data sets, I mean, we talk about the invisibility of migrants, right? So how do I make them visible? So I'm not talking about capturing the household or the individual. Now, if you believe that there are X million number of people who are seasonal migrants, who are basically moving from their place where the ration card was issued to another place where, so they will not be taking ration from that spot. So does the one nation, one ration card even cater to what fraction of that X million? So for me, using these administrative data sets is actually to make that invisible number visible. That's how we are going to get to a decent coverage when we talk about portability. So Mitali spoke about portability. Yes, we can achieve portability, but we need to track that number. So it's in that context that I said it, but not in terms of a specific household or specific individuals.
Thank you. I'm just going to say, add a last question here addressed to...
Shunaldi, I put my hand up there.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying when you said last question, I got worried. So that's why I can wait.
Please, I'm actually...
No, I'll wait.
No, I'm going to address that last question to you and then let you have a time to reflect on other issues. The question is from Nawaz Ahmed, who really appreciated your focus on property rights and associated with women's migration. And he had a follow-up question on how do we sort of figure out what are the women leaving behind? How many of them have received their due share? Can we collect data on it? Can we look at it?
Okay. Now, this is obviously something which can only be done through not just micro studies, but I would say long-term ethnographic studies, because these are not things which people will tell you at once. It's as you spend time, but it relates to the question of the natal property and the conjugal property, the fixed, the unfixed, but it's also, of course, a question about social relations, about social capital, which they may or may not build. And, do they leave social capital behind? They often they are not even able to build much social capital before they have to move. So it's a very difficult question. I'm not quite sure how to address it, but yes, if we are going to address it, it would have to be through qualitative studies and small data sets, I would say, rather than long term. And the other thing is that, the question of leaving behind goes along with the question of the idea of that migration and movement mean loss. And in one sense, what I've been trying to suggest is that if we move from the idea of migration to mobility, that both migration and mobility are the normal state of being, then there are certain things which will have to change in terms of policies, etc., so that people don't have loss. But then we also stop necessarily, yes, when people are forced to go back, as with COVID, the loss is not because they moved, but now because they're being forced to go back. I'm not being able to express this very clearly, but essentially what I'm suggesting is that there's a sentimentality which gets tied to the idea of the place of belonging, which is very important, which, it's very critical. But at least through the way we think about it, we need to change and think of it being something which is regular. Just the one other thing which I was wanting to put at the side is that there's a huge set of people who we should be talking of as nomads, not migrants even, whom I looked at them in the context of care, which are all our IS, IFS, Army, the top level bureaucrats, the army, who are constantly on the move. And it is interesting that though they are constantly on the move, because all the facilities are in place for them when they're on the move. It's part of their package. Why doesn't that get taken as the model for other migrants? And of course, they are the modern day nomads, top level bureaucrats and military services. So that was the thing I just wanted to throw at the side, but it also adds to my point about how let's think of migration and mobility as the norm, as the mainstream.
That is fascinating, Radhi. I had never thought about it, modern day nomads among the army and the bureaucracy. But it's a really interesting thought. We are running out of time, and I just wanted to end by thanking all of our panelists for a really rich and interesting conversation. It just tells us how both the issue that we are dealing with is complex, and yet it's so much encompasses all of our daily experiences in our lives. There was a question from the audience as to where can they find recording of this webinar. Please look at NCER's website, ncaer.org by tomorrow. We should have a link to the webinar. It will be available on YouTube as well. Thank you to all our panelists and all the people in the audience. This has been a great, enriching conversation. Reshma, do you have a last word?
Thanks to everybody. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shunali, Reshma, and all the other panelists. I've learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much.